Slow practice is what every teacher recommends, but going along slowly doesn't guarantee progress. It doesn't eliminate mistakes. It doesn't make you better tomorrow or the week after. It's how you use your time and the tools that you employ during your slow practice that makes it effective. So here are 5 of the most common problems that I see in slow practice with students and how to fix them. First up, the tempo is actually too slow. When your tempo is too slow, it doesn't build muscle memory. It doesn't build neural connections. And what I call ultra slow practice, it's actually one of the most difficult ways to practice, and it shouldn't be used until very late in the learning process. And that's used mostly to test and to reinforce things that have already been learned to a deep level. But lots of students take an ultra slow tempo on their first day or even in their first week because they're trying to eliminate mistakes. Now, instead of slowing our tempo down so far that we don't retain anything, let's shorten the chunk of music that we're trying to learn. Let's even take this to an extreme right now. Let's say it takes you a few seconds to move from beat 1 to beat 2. And yes, I've seen this actually quite often when I do practice audits with students who are starting to learn a new piece. I even had a student yesterday with this exact problem. And the problem is, instead of working on just getting from beat 1 to beat 2, they continue to push on through maybe 4 bars of music or more, thinking that, one phrase is a short chunk compared to the entire piece. But by the time they've finished one pass through those 4 bars, it might be a minute or 2 minutes of time that's gone by. And our focus has just been so disconnected and chopped up that all of those minutes have just been completely wasted. So if we recognize that getting from beat 1 to beat 2 is a challenge, then plan your practice chunk to only be those 2 beats. It is not too small of a chunk. Work on your movement between those 2 beats. Make sure that you're planning and executing the best fingerings for those 2 beats and that you're using the same ones on every repetition. And most often, what's written in your score is going to be pretty darn good. And then start to increase from something that's ultra slow, if you need that just to get the notes right, start to increase that to just a good slow tempo. So how slow is too slow? For typical early learning and practice, like learning at the beginning of learning a new piece, let's say that too slow is any tempo where your movement at the keyboard stops during your planned chunks. It stops from getting from beat 1 to beat 2. So if we're stopping on each beat to think about what comes next, not only are we possibly building an incorrect neuromuscular pathway, but it's also likely that we simply aren't building any pathway at all. There is a certain minimum tempo that we need to surpass for the brain to retain the movement information that we're putting in. Here is exactly what happened with this problem with my student that I saw yesterday. So my student yesterday was working on Chopin's 6th Prelude, and they got a couple measures into the piece to this spot. That's it in tempo, so right? But what they played when they first played it for me was that slow, right? No, that's an ultra slow tempo. That's extremely hard to navigate from one beat to the next. This isn't even from beat to beat. This is from 8th note to 8th note. And the problem was, every time that they did a repetition, they were completely rereading all of the notes, and the tempo is so slow, they're not building any connection to muscle memory. There are no neuromuscular pathways being built from repetition to repetition. So what did we do? We created a very small chunk to start with, 3 8th notes long. We tried doing this both hands together. We read it off the score. We didn't read it. We looked down at our hands and played it from memory. And then I said, start to speed it up. And speed it up further. Speed it up further. Speed it up beyond the tempo that we need. And something really interesting happened. My student had absolutely no problem anymore playing through those 3/8 confidently, and they started to be able to make a phrase. It started to sound like music instead of with so much thought about where every finger is going to go and where the next note is in hopes that we're not going to make a mistake, right? Did a couple mistakes happen during that process? A couple happened, sure, but they were quickly worked out. Now, something really interesting happened after that point because I said then, well, let's slow the tempo back down to a nice, good practice tempo. Something like that. And what happened the first time through was that they completely weren't able to do it. We had our fast tempo, and they could execute over and over and over and over again. We did 5 repetitions in a row that were all flawless and played with a good phrase. And when we said drop the tempo back down to slow, they didn't even know anymore where to go with the hands. It's really an interesting problem. So instead of saying, hey, we reached this, we built muscle memory at a fast tempo, and now drop it all the way back down, we slowly and gradually tapered the tempo from something that's far too fast to put back into context and to practice slowly in the future. We said, take a little bit off. And then a little bit more. And a little bit more. And then finally, we've reached our slow practice tempo again. And when we went through all of those steps, first of all, increasing the tempo. They had worked on this segment for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, every day, diligently practicing and working hard. And within 5 minutes of doing this in our lesson, starting slow, speeding the tempo up to an uncomfortably fast tempo, beyond performance tempo, and then incrementally slowing it back down, they built muscle memory, they retained the muscle memory, and then they were able to go back to a slow tempo without being, what I'll say is, overwhelmed by reading every single note on the page or overwhelmed by every single finger movement. They were feeling things in one gesture. We did that for 3/8 notes, and then we started to expand that by 1/8 note more, by 2/8 notes more, and in a very short amount of time, this passage that was very difficult for them went from being painfully slow, not even able to hear the phrase, right, to able to play fluently, also by memory, but most important, able to play fluently and in tempo or close to tempo. Yeah? And it was a matter of minutes instead of weeks and weeks. And that problem all happened because that student took an ultra slow practice tempo when they started learning instead of trying to build the muscle memory. And so they spent 2 weeks and no muscle memory was built. None at all. Now, there's a lot of information out on YouTube, a lot of which has come out in just the past year about how relying on muscle memory isn't a good thing in practice. And you know what? That is good advice. And it's even advice that I give kind of all the time, depending on the student. But it is not good advice if you don't have any muscle memory to begin with. Let's face it, playing the piano requires movement. It requires precise movement, and it requires movement that can be repeated accurately time after time. And there is no amount of conscious thought that can replace what the motor cortex in the brain is so amazing at. So harness building muscle memory if you aren't. Think of it like the foundation. Yeah, we can build lots of other things on top of the foundation. We can support the foundation in other ways. But without muscle memory in the first place, we almost can't play anything. This subject is so important, and I've seen so many people struggle with it that I actually did another video on this topic, but from the opposite perspective. It's about how to take faster tempi from our first day of practice and the benefits of doing that. I will leave a link up here in the corner for you and in the description down below. All right, the next most common problem. The reason for your next slow repetition either doesn't exist or it's not a good reason. How often do you think to yourself, I'll just do that again, or I'll just play that again? Most people are probably going to say they think that all the time. But the best answer in practice would be, I never think that. Every time that you choose to repeat a section in practice, first of all, you're making the important choice to reinforce something, and that in itself is great. But now answer the question of what you're going to reinforce. What are you going to make better? How are you going to experiment with dynamic, let's say? Or even to tie in with the previous point, how are we going to purposely focus on the feeling of gesture that we're making with the body to further reinforce muscle memory with conscious thought? Every time you stop and you restart, you should have an answer for this question. And it doesn't need to be a new answer every time you make a repetition. You might choose to work on the same thing a few times in a row, and that's great, but have that specific reason in mind before you start. And if your reason is, I'm trying to make it better, that is almost as bad as having no reason at all. Our reason to repeat in practice is what gives us focus. It's what allows us to place our attention on one or maybe two specific things that we're going to address in the next repetition. No reason or too general of a reason leads us to a lack of focus, which then leads to poor retention or no retention because of what I call power saver mode in the brain. If you want to guarantee a waste of time, spend 10 minutes repeating a bar with no real focus on what you're doing. You might make a couple gains in those moments. It might actually even feel pretty good after those 10 minutes, but almost guaranteed, it's not going to be in your brain or your fingers an hour later, and it's definitely not going to be there the next day because your brain will have tuned out for 9.5 of those 10 minutes. So have a good, clear, definitive, and specific reason that you're repeating a phrase or a chunk in practice, and know exactly the one or the two things that you're going to focus on in the next repetition. I've got 3 more problems and their fixes for you in a second, but if you like this sort of deep dive into practice habits and how to practice more effectively, check out my course, Mastering Your Practice. Learn more in less time. I've left a link down below in the description for you. The course is full of game-changing information, and I add to it pretty regularly. And there's even a section where I interview master teachers about their own practice habits. The first of those segments with Busoni competition winner Robert Hamilton is available in the course, and more are coming soon. So check it out. And now let's get back to the video. The next most common problem is looping in practice. Looping in practice isn't just a slow practice problem, but the bad habit of doing this begins during slow practice. Looping is when we take a small chunk. We might even know how we want to improve that chunk, but then we repeat and repeat and repeat that section with no pause or stopping. If we take the Chopin prelude, it would be like doing this. Over and over. I've seen some teachers even teach to do this. But looping is like a death sentence for your retention into later today and especially into tomorrow. Just a 1 or a 2 second pause between repeats is huge for the learning process, and it's almost no time at all. But first, it gives you time to think about the reason for the next repeat, like we talked about. Second, it stops the potential building of a wrong neuromuscular pathway because in performance, you're never going to go from the end of the phrase, from here, back to the beginning of that phrase. But if you loop, you're reinforcing a movement that will never occur in the performance of the piece. And third, the brain does a small form of consolidation during that 1 or 2 second pause. Think of consolidation as kind of like what happens overnight when you sleep on something and then you get up the next day and the answer is right there for you. It's like magic, right? Overnight, the brain does a lot of that, but by using a 1 or 2 second gap in practice, you can create a little version, a small version of that same thing right in the middle of your practice session. So stop looping and just add in a couple second break, like, right? And use that time during the break to focus on how the next repetition is going to be improved. More legato, different dynamic. Am I needing to focus on what specific fingers are doing, right? Pick that really precise reason. Next up, we have too much time spent on one chunk. I had a student earlier this week who diligently picked out the spots in their repertoire that needed the most work. That's great. That's great. It's a great first step. But then they proceeded to drill those spots for sometimes 10 or 20 minutes for just a single measure. Now, the more advanced of a student that you are, the longer you might be able to go and retain focus and make every one of those repetitions like that, make them count for a lot. But 20 minutes on one bar that maybe takes like 5 seconds to play through, that's something like 12 repetitions per minute and possibly something like 240 repetitions over 20 minutes. Put like that, when you see the numbers, right, you can see that this is a little crazy to ask your brain to pay attention and continue to improve over 240 repetitions of the same thing. Our brains like things that are new and that are different. They are curious. Right? The vast majority of those repetitions, they're going to be totally wasted, even if you're following the 3 previous fixes from this video. If you really want to work hard on a small chunk, and you've been able to identify that, put on a timer and limit how long you're working on that little chunk of music. For beginners and intermediate students, I'd recommend no more than 5 minutes. When your timer goes off, move on to something else. That doesn't mean that you can't come back later in your practice to the same spot to further reinforce, but give your brain a break from it. For advanced students, you might be able to push this closer to like 10 minutes, especially if you have great practice habits already built. But I'd argue that that's really only necessary for like an etude level technical challenge chunk. I don't mean just an etude, but anything that's a really, really technical challenge for you. So for example, taking an etude, we might practice an etude for an hour, but that hour is going to be purposefully broken up into 5 and 10 minute chunks that work on different passages and hopefully work on slightly different challenges. When you get really good at this, you'll start to recognize that feeling that you get during practice. You can actually learn to recognize when your brain is turning off. And when you get there, you don't have to use a timer anymore, right? Because you've become sensitive to like the brain fatigue and what that feels like. But until we reach that point where we can feel that, the timer is your friend here. So limit your blocked time on one chunk. And if you want to continue to reinforce it later, come back in 20 or 30 minutes to that same spot, or come back later today in another practice session. One last common problem is coming up, but do me a favor and drop a comment down below about which of these slow practice traps that you have been falling into in the past and which ones you're going to implement later today in your own practice. All right, the last problem. Slow practice is never challenged or varied enough. If all you're doing is taking a tempo that's far under performance tempo, a slow tempo, right? How do you know if the fingering you've chosen actually works at performance tempo? How do you know if you're executing legato and the way you're executing it actually works at performance tempo? How do you know if the movements that you're so diligently practicing in at your slow tempo, how do you know if those are too large to be efficient at performance tempo? Or is there tension that's going to creep in at performance tempo that doesn't exist at all in your slow tempo? Slow practice should always be informed by where we need to go next. Just about anyone, beginners included, you can play the notes of a Chopin etude if the tempo is slow enough, right? But how do we learn to bridge the gap from slow to performance tempo? The most common method I've seen is to incrementally speed up. I've had some students call this tempo laddering, to riff on something that's on Molly Gebrian's great channel. She calls it the click up method, where we slowly increase the speed of our metronome as we play against it. It's a little more complex than that, but that's the basic idea. These methods can work, but only if your technique is already really secure and really well developed. And if it's not, we hit a wall with our tempo where it's just impossible to go any faster. So how do we get around that wall and break through? We do that with experimentation. So experiment with one repetition here and there that's significantly faster than your slow practice tempo. Pay attention and use the information that your body tells you about how you are unprepared for that fast tempo to change and inform how to do your next slow repetitions. Okay? A faster tempo is going to uncover tension issues, and it's going to uncover exactly where they start. It's going to show you where specific fingers might be failing you. And then it's going to guide you into the kind of maybe rhythmic grouping practice that you need to do, or the kind of finger or wrist attack that we need to use next in our slow practice. Here's the truth. Slow practice alone only leads to performance tempo if you execute your slow practice exactly the same way as you must execute performance tempo. For the vast majority of pianists on the planet, professionals included, we learn what performance tempo requires by occasionally testing there, and then using our findings to change our slow tempo practice. If it's one quick pass here and there at a faster tempo, we aren't building a bad habit. We're using a tool to find how to make all of our next slow repetitions even more productive. I'm Szczepanek. This is Pianist Academy, where we make elite piano simple and attainable. Like and subscribe to this channel for more tips like these, and check out Next Level Pianist Academy in the description below, where I help pianists from beginner to degree holding take their playing and their practice to levels that they never thought possible before. I'll see you next time.